We are all set, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the October 15th, 2024 meeting of the Long Range Planning Committee, LRPC, and the Zoning Committee. So we will be holding a hybrid public meeting which enables remote electronic participation as legally authorized by the Code of Virginia. Per the Planning Commission's electronic meeting policy adopted on July 7th, 2022. Members of the commission can participate both in person and virtually for electronic means. At this time, I'd like to orient everyone for a hybrid environment and cover a few specifics about tonight's meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting here in person or electronically by using the Microsoft Teams link provided in the LRPC and ZOCO web pages, the county's event calendar, and the email notification sent to LRPC and ZOCO email subscribers. Additionally, there's a dial-in phone option for those who wish to use it. For our virtual attendees using Microsoft Teams, please turn off your video feed and keep your microphone muted as you enter the meeting and during the meeting. Microsoft Teams meeting chat will only be used to provide instructions for virtual attendees on how to register for public comments and to field general questions about Microsoft Teams. The Teams chat will not otherwise be monitored by staff or the Planning Commission during the meeting, nor will it be used to collect feedback. Unlike the Planning Commission's regular meetings, the LRPC and ZOCO agenda items are not public hearings. Therefore, public comments is the chair's discretion after the committee discussion has concluded. Public comments associated with agenda items can be provided by people attending in person and virtually. For in-person attendees, indicate on the meeting sign-in sheet that you would like to provide public comment. For virtual attendees, indicate in the Teams chat that you would like to provide public comment and your name will be added to the list of speakers. As a reminder, you can always provide written comments via the link that is provided in the Teams chat and on ZOCO's website. All written comments are shared with the Planning Commission and posted to the ZOCO page for public viewing. All comments received as of noon today have already been shared with the Commission. I will call for speakers at the end of the meeting, and I will ask Mr. Rogers to let me know if we have virtual attendees who would like to provide comments. Mr. Alfonso Amhed will acknowledge speakers to the chat.
Yep,
Right?
yep. Natasha's in the Teams chat supporting us tonight.
Okay. Sorry. Members of the public attending virtually will speak first, following by in-person attendees. When virtual attendees are called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is located in the meeting command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. Lastly, this is a public forum. Today's meeting will be recorded and posted to the county website. All information associated with today's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Great. With that, I'll do a round of introductions. I am co-chairing this with the LRPC chair tonight. My name is Leo Sarli, and I'm here representing the Planning Commission.
Hi, good evening. Eric Berkey, also with the Planning Commission, and I will be chairing, or I guess co-chairing, the LRPC part of the meeting.
My name is Tony Striner with the Planning Commission.
Peter Robertson, Planning Commission.
My name is Ashraf Sabreen. I'm with the American Civics Institute. We work in affordable housing. Just here to observe.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Welcome.
Road staff.
Nick Rogers, county staff, and ZOCO liaison.
Mark McCauley, county staff.
Jill Hunger, county staff.
And who do we have online?
Mr. Chair, I know we've got at least one planning commissioner. Chair Steinberger is here.
Hello, Chair Steinberger. Apologies for virtual juggling childcare. Thank you.
Welcome. Then staff.
Natasha, would you introduce yourself? Oh, Natasha, you are muted.
Sorry, I have too many things open. Good evening, Natasha Alfonso. I'm with the County Staff for Planning Division.
And we have several other virtual attendees as well.
All right. So everyone, welcome to the committee. And then I will hand it over to Ms. Rhodes to do our first item on the agenda, which is childcare. You can look up the correct name for the item. Buy Ms. Rhodes some time. Childcare zoning ordinance amendment, family daycare homes.
Great, thank you. I'm Margaret Rhodes with the Planning Division, and I'm going to be sharing some information tonight about some child care zoning ordinance amendments related to family daycare homes and the SD zoning district. As you all know, child care is a key component of a thriving and diverse community. And in 2019, Arlington County undertook a very extensive child care initiative aimed at eliminating barriers to child care and addressing accessibility, availability, and quality of childcare. And to continue this work, we are proposing 2 additional amendments now. The first is related to family daycare homes. So family daycare homes with up to 9 children that comply with applicable zoning are permitted by right. They originally had required use permits, but that was removed. The use permit requirement was removed in 2019. So currently, the larger family daycare homes with 10 to 12 children do require a use permit. And enabling by right approval of these daycare homes would facilitate the expansion of childcare. Since there are zoning standards and other permitting process and reviews, which we'll look at next, already in place, requiring this use permit is unnecessary and burdensome. So here are just some of the reviews that are ongoing. So you can see that Arlington County and the Commonwealth have a number of agencies and review processes in place. These would all remain in place even if we remove the use permit requirement. There has been a 5-year observation period since the zoning ordinance was amended to allow these larger family daycare homes. And during that time period, we've seen a very good overall performance, and we have not seen issues related specifically to any of those things that are addressed solely by the use permit. So staff recommends allowing for the by right zoning approval of these larger family daycare homes. And of course, as I mentioned, all of these other county codes and reviews would remain in place. And then in terms of follow-on work, should the amendment to remove the use permit be approved, then we would move to discontinue those daycare use permit, the family daycare home use permits, maybe early in 2025. The second amendment that we wanted to bring to your attention is an amendment to the SD or Special District Zoning District. The Arlington County zoning ordinance currently permits child care centers and all other daycare uses by use permit in every single zoning district except for one, SD. This discrepancy was identified during the child care initiative back in 2019 as something that warranted additional examination at a future date. So staff recommends amending this district so that every zoning district could permit child care centers and other daycare uses. As you can see from this map, and it's probably easier to see in the memo that was circulated, there are really not many SD parcels throughout the county. They are typically characterized currently by hospital and senior living type uses. And here we can see those areas that are designated semi-public and government and community facilities. So SD is associated on the general land use plan with these categories and with public. Again, they're outlined in black here, and there are not really that many semi-public and government community facility parcels throughout the county. And we took a look at some of the equity considerations, and here you can see that the parcels that are currently zoned SD, which are outlined here in red, are often found adjacent to or within areas where there's a greater percentage of people of color and persons of color, and those that may be housing cost burdened as well. So permitting access to childcare or facilitating the creation of potential childcare uses in these districts would help from an equity consideration. And then lastly, as we were going through the zoning ordinance and combing it, looking for all those areas that were touched by either the family daycare homes or the SD, we noticed that there is a small difference in how some of these daycare childcare uses are worded in the form-based code districts. And so we propose as part of this to also bring forward some changes. This is really just changing a word here and there so that all of the text throughout the zoning ordinance will be the same. But there are no substantive changes at all to this. It's really just tweaking the language. As you can see here, we have an example. And so to kind of go through what we're doing, we're really working to continue to build on the work that was done in 2019 as part of the Child Care Initiative. And these amendments will help to facilitate the expansion and provision of childcare throughout the county. And that concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Rhodes. Let's bring the conversation to the table then, and the commissioners that are online. Any questions or clarifications for Ms. Rhodes?
Well, I'll go ahead. And she knows what the question is going to be. I gave her a sneak preview earlier, but one of the things when there are use permits, right, is that there's an advertisement. The county seeks to get input from the civic associations. And do you mind just speaking to the type of input or the feedback that staff has generally heard in these use permit requests up till now? Parking, is it noise? Like, I'm not trying to lead you, but can you discuss kind of the concerns and how they were mitigated?
Yeah, so when a new use permit or historically a new use permit had been requested for one of these family daycare homes, for instance, at times we would hear concerns from the community about noise, parking, and traffic. So those were probably the top three. But what we found in subsequent reviews, once the uses were established, is that those issues had kind of gone away. So for instance, with parking, they're required to have one space on site. A number of these locations are also on bus lines or near metro. In terms
Spaces off the off-street spaces,
yes.
Right?
And then, so for, in terms of noise, there was sometimes a concern that, outdoor playtime would have a noise impact on adjacent properties. And we're not seeing that in the follow-up reviews.
Sure.
And then trip generation, people were concerned about traffic, but because there's typically some staggering in the pickup and drop off, and it's generally limited to maybe 2 times per day, morning and in the afternoon, again, we weren't really seeing a problem. So typically, according to childcare staff, any issues really that were raised when the childcare use was originally being proposed really didn't manifest itself again during any of the subsequent reviews. So in terms of those concerns that were related solely to what is addressed through the use permit, we've seen, overall very good results and not things that needed to be kind of brought up again and again.
Right, which is the whole point of why you're bringing it now, which is to say there's not really outstanding issues that warrant continued review in a use permit scenario.
Yeah,
capacity
correct.
Size. Well, and I just speaking anecdotally as a parent who's I'm almost through paying for 3 children to go to their childcare. Very excited for those payments to end in about 10 months. Not that I'm counting. But I will say, and then having done the first 2 in a family home scenario, the 3rd one now is in a center. I think every parent who drops kids off at daycare, even if it's on street, right, in a neighborhood, you get to know the sequencing of when the other parents are there, and you maybe intentionally stagger your trips, and you kind of go, I want to be this kind of window. That's assuming the child cooperates, obviously, getting in the car. And so I think that is one of those ways that kind of also probably works itself out in practice.
Yeah, and I have a statistic here from the child care office, and they're saying that all of the 24 family daycare homes that are still operating have had their use permit renewed without any issues raised by the community.
That was my question.
Great. Anyone else?
Yes, I have also one question. So I'm no expert in childcare, but is there a reason why we're bumping it up to 10 to 12 and not higher?
Yeah, so I don't know. I wasn't part of the child care initiative back in 2019, so Nick may have some background on this. But originally, the family daycare homes only permitted up to 9 children.
Right.
So there was a conscious effort to increase that a little bit, and so it went to 12. And now we've had 5 years of taking a look at up to 12 children. So I think the daycare centers obviously permit more children, but the family daycare homes tend to be smaller, more family run and typically in a residential area. But I don't know if you have anything else.
The only thing I'll add, Commissioner Streiner, is that as Margaret mentioned, the home childcare, the family daycare homes that we call them, are regulated by the state's Department of Social Services. And so in order for a home childcare provider like this to operate out of a residence, there's a licensing requirement.
Sure.
And the maximum number of children that DSS will authorize through that licensing is 12.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in an effort to align, so we don't have those disconnects,
Right.
our zoning,
Got
in
it.
2019 was written to match those state requirements. And as Margaret mentioned, there had been this sort of awkward disconnect prior to that, amongst other aspects of childcare that were addressed with the childcare initiative, that was one of the biggest ones to just kind of get us lined up.
Yeah.
We were not the only jurisdiction in Virginia that has needed to go through that alignment.
Well, and to be fair, I don't want to be unnecessarily critical of the county 10, 15 years ago, but I think before there was that the child care initiative and Katie Crystal, many props to her for leadership on that. I don't know that the county as a whole had really taken this issue maybe quite as seriously from like a land use perspective, right? So I think now, as you're saying it, Nick, it's like, duh, why wouldn't we do this? But I think 5, 10 years ago, it's sort of like, well, that's what you do, because we just need to make sure if there's one of these operating in our neighborhoods, kind of what we do. And I think now, after all this analysis, it's like, wait a minute, we don't need it. Like, we've reached that point now where it's kind of a slam dunk in my view.
Yeah, we know it's safe. Let's go forward. So I was just more curious.
Sure.
Yeah, I like this.
The only other thing I'll pile on is that the state, the DSS stipulates as sort of a precondition of that license that the provider follow and adhere to all local zoning laws. So there is kind of the right hand talking to the left in that regard as well.
Great. Is that it? Anyone online? I don't see any hands up.
I don't see any questions from Commissioner Steinberger.
That's a public comment.
Yeah.
We're gonna have public comment at the end, so if you can put your name on the chat, we will add you to the list and do a public comment in a few minutes. So just to follow up on Commissioner Streiner's comment, we are catching up to neighboring jurisdictions at this point. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking and, we are one of only, 4 jurisdictions in the state that have these. I think we're the only one that actually has the dual use permit review and state review. Yeah, we're the only jurisdiction that requires the approval of a special exception use permit for child care programs already regulated by the Virginia Department of Education. And one of only 4 that also regulates family daycare homes with 4 or fewer children, not otherwise regulated by the state. And we're also state regulating family daycare homes with 5 or more children. So they're essentially dual licensed. So a lot of our other jurisdictions have either never put this in place or kind of perhaps eliminated it over time. So we're in a sort of elite group that's maybe dual licensing.
Not in a good, at least.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
I agree with you.
In a group of duplicative.
All right. Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're clear on that we're not, going out into some uncharted territory.
No.
This is just us catching up
Yeah.
to really what is best practices and our common practice. With that, I think not seeing any questions on the table and or questions on the virtual table.
Mr. Chair, we did have a hand up from the attendee labeled Rudy. So Rudy, if you can hear me right now, feel free to turn on your camera and microphone and
And just to be clear, we're going into public comment now, so we're done with the conversation. And Rudy, you have about 2 minutes.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. One thing that I find curious, although it wasn't mentioned in the presentation, the Clarendon Presbyterian Church is facing a insurmountable challenge to constructing their 6-story building, having their property designated SD. But the problem that they are facing that precludes them from doing this is specifically that they want to include a construction of a daycare facility. Now, although it wasn't mentioned in this presentation, isn't it true that we are addressing this issue now specifically to help the CPC overcome this issue? One. And number two, they face a number of other insurmountable issues at this point that unless the zoning ordinances are changed, that construction is going to have to come to a halt. My question is, why wasn't any of this mentioned in the presentation?
So I think this is a little tangential, and Ms. Rhodes, you can answer and or correct me if I'm giving the wrong answer. But as I understand it, we are strictly talking about home daycare use and not the center, which would be what the church would be likely pursuing.
So for SD, we're recommending that they allow childcare, not just family daycare homes, but
Right.
all different childcare uses in SD. And so this was something, the genesis for this was back in 2019. So you can go back to the childcare initiative and it's mentioned there that SD is the only zoning district that does not permit these uses. And so that was something flagged then, and I guess it wasn't a priority. There were so many different things that were amended at that time because there's so few sites with SD, as we saw from the map, that I don't think this rose to the top of the priorities. So it's something we've had on our radar for 5 years. And so we went through the 5 years observing our larger family daycare homes. So we wanted to go ahead and kind of report back on that, and we haven't been seeing issues. So we want to get rid of that kind of burdensome additional use permit requirement. And so while we were doing that, we looked at, well, is there something else we can package with this? Other things that we said we were going to do in 2019. And one of them was to universally permit childcare in every single zoning district. So that was the genesis.
All right, thank you. Do we have any public speakers in the room? No. All right. I think with that, I'm going to wrap up this part of the meeting, and we are going to roll into our second agenda item, and this is the LRPC section. So
Sure.
I'll turn it over to Commissioner Berkey so I can take a break.
Sure, great segue. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. All right, so now we're going to be talking about the transformation of obsolete office buildings, policy, and also an adaptive reuse zoning ordinance amendments. We've got Mark McCauley and Jill Hunger who are going to take us away with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair Berkey, Chair Sarli, for hosting this meeting. So yes, as we discussed, as you just introduced, as you introduced, Mark McCauley with Arlington Economic Development. I'm here with Jill Hunger from CPHD. We're the co-chairs of the Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative as a broad initiative and co-leading this effort to look at transforming Arlington's office buildings. And as we'll talk about with a broad policy and then a look at the specific instances of adaptive reuse. So we RTA'd in September two items. One is a county board policy addressing all of transformation of office buildings, and we'll go over that. And then a zoning ordinance amendment that looked at how to reflect within the zoning ordinance a first focus on adaptive reuse. We also add a third leg, which isn't for necessarily for board approval, but it's important to the context, which is the administrative guidelines and regulations that support both the implementation of the policy and of the zoning ordinance. And it's critical to a lot of decision-making on the viability of this project. So we'll continue to discuss that in November, albeit not with an official county board vote. So I'm going to go over the first section of the policy. I'm happy to answer questions. I shortened this down from the LRPC meeting, given that that was a pretty substantial conversation and a long presentation. So not skipping, but trying to sort of move forward that conversation. Happy to answer questions about anything we presented back then as well, but want to leave more time for the discussion with the committees. So again, one of the things that we want to run in more detail was the why, not to overstate it again, but the combination of real market challenges in the commercial office sector that's led to not only vacancy, but in particular vacancy in what we call obsolete office buildings, which is office buildings that are becoming less and less competitive, if not non-competitive, to lease up to office tenants, given their age, given the design, the functionality, the amenities, so on, the system, so on and so forth. And within that broader framework and some macro level trends, declining office values and assessments that is really threatening our fiscal base and our tax revenues, but also, as we've talked about, also impact our sense of place and quality of life, whether it be tax revenues pay for things that we enjoy as a community, or the impact that vacant buildings can have on neighborhoods when they persist for too long. We also note that while the markets continue to shift, and you see some good news recently, and we continue to hope to see good news on rates and things like that, the worst may yet to come, if only because our assessments lag. And for those that don't understand our assessments work, they tend to go in the year prior. And so therefore, sometimes sudden shocks don't show up in your tax rolls until a year later or more. And so while we continue to see Board of Equalization appeals for office buildings and continued discussion, we still may see some significant decline in office values. And that means real tax dollars available for other services. So what is the overarching policy statement? And you'll see the part in red is something that we've added since the October 1st. And I'll point out wherever those cases may be. But as we commented last time, there's an October 1st version that'll be updated probably in the next week or so with some more feedback from this and other meetings. But the current overarching policy is focusing on a bold public policy and regulatory intervention to look at urgently at the adverse economic, fiscal, and placemaking impacts of the commercial sector. And Jill will go over this in more detail, but important for how we regulate our zoning to establish as a public priority newer amended policies to remove or repurpose obsolete office space and transform that basis into more productive uses. So I broke this up relative to how they're listed in the document. The document's still going to be reformatted with some of these numbering in terms of our policy statements, but in terms of just for ability to track with the current October 1st version, these are some of the policy statements, most important policy statements that we pulled out. One obviously is again iterating our sort of supporting the broad goal of the bold forward-looking urgent policy to focus on obsolete office buildings. Second, as I said, to establish the public priority, which is key. And then 4, 5, 6, and 8 provide a series of guidance on a streamlined approach. Now, it's important to note in this chapter of the policy, this is dealing with all efforts to look at obsolete office supply. So we'll talk about the adaptive reuse, and we'll talk about other tools. This is really just tee up either direct discussions about adaptive reuse and or future discussions of things like other forms of redevelopment, building reposition, those sort of things. So it's really saying for all of these types that we should be looking as a county at how to look at a streamlined approach. And that can be newer and clearer processes so that it's very understandable what process you enter and how that process is worked through the system. A pared down checklist. So the checklist is very simply just the requirements of a submittal. For major site plan amendments, it can be quite extensive and quite costly. We're looking at how to streamline that down in terms of cost and timing. Therefore, a more focused staff review, not stopping review of certain things, but sort of saying, let's focus on the details of this change of a building. Concise engagement, as we talked about at last meeting, and we have another slide at the end to continue that discussion with the committee and the commission about what the role of public engagement is and how to do that and streamline it, but also get the value out of that engagement. And then things like site plan standards, which are what do we typically require of new or buildings that are seeking site plan amendments. How do we really sort of look at those standards in an appropriate way to not overburden these adaptive reuse projects with additional costs or expectations that aren't achievable. And that includes not only our typical site and development standards, our ones that are done through practice, but some county goals and policies and those sort of things. And then finally, and I'll reference this policy, but this is really key where the policy is. Jill will talk a lot about the ordinance, is what modifications we want the board to allow and how to provide those modifications, in particular by looking at different ways to earn density for minimal changes to a building and adaptive reuse. So when we look at the adaptive reuse, the focus, again, Jill's going to talk a lot of it, so I won't go to this too much. But the initial focus of this is on site plan amendments. So we haven't asked about by right projects. It is certainly on our radar, but for the sake of clarity of this process, I focus just on buildings that are approved by site plan or being amended by site plan. We're not going to affect previously committed community benefits, major community benefits. So if there's a park next to a building, this isn't going to be a process to remove or change that park. And then we talked a lot about these other things through that slide, including like I said, the interaction with other county policies. And again, what is the streamlined process guidance? So what is the policy guidance? It's for a new process, looking at a streamlined timeline, really making it a clear and different process than our current our definitions of major, minor, and admin that is going through its own study, but we really want to make this clear and distinct so it couldn't be mistaken. That after looking at administrative pathways for in a variety of forms, we still settled on county board action is going to be required to amend a previously approved site plan, but really streamlining that approach is the key here. And then the criteria flexible, and Jill will go this again, but the idea of we want to set a guardrails of who can apply for these office buildings and site plans. We also don't want to create unnecessary limitations that we go back and sort of say that wasn't all that telling in terms of the type of project that we can put in. And then density allowances, the way that Jill has prepared the ordinance. This is going to be a list of things that the board can consider for amendments, but you look at it's really about making a building better. It's not fundamentally changing the form, the height, density. Those things are not part of it, but it's about making better facade, better ground floor environment. Additions of balconies, which as you imagine, if it's converting to residential or hospitality, may be an important function. Things like rooftop amenities, where maybe right now it's mechanical. So all those things are important. One thing that we have a lot more discussion, I think, in a relatively short amount of time is we also are very excited about maybe thinking about the conversion of unused parking or unrequired parking, I should say. And that's where with a new use, but also with new standards of how the county looks at parking requirements, both from an ordinance and a policy perspective, where we say the current structure is the current garage is not going away, but it's got too many parking spaces that we need. And what do you do with that space? And how do you allow other uses that would be counted as gross floor area into them? And then potentially what benefits does that provide for other improvements on site and off site to really improve that, to really reflect that transportation demand shift. In relation to sector plans, again, this body, or at least half of this body particularly is well familiar with our sector plans and our guidance in those. Many of those set up long-term visions, some of which get down to very prescriptive, some of which are more guidance level. But a lot of them still do deal with things like use for a particular site or for a certain block, or those that are mixed by sector area. A lot of them also look at very most of our sector plans are pretty transformative. So they're looking at how does a building move and what creates, is it a street, is it a road? And so some of the questions that this process will ask as it goes through, particularly as new proposals, is if that building was supposed to be quote unquote torn down as part of a sector plan, is repurposing in the best interest of the county. And I think in general, we would argue that the repurposing does not add lifetimes to a building. It still adds a short amount of time. But we really want that. Obviously, that's going to be something at the front and center of the county board decisions, both for this policy and for any projects. And then finally, we have the Affordable Housing Master Plan. We had a good meeting with the Housing Commission the other night, where we had a good discussion about why this process may not be the appropriate way to meet affordable housing goals, given the nature of change or non-change to a building, but still some good constructive conversation about that. We are actively engaging with other staff and at a commission level about our sustainable building and green building. And that's obviously a hot topic, and we'll continue that through November. And then, as I mentioned, commercial and residential parking ratio policies, which today provide the board a lot of leeway in reducing parking requirements in our site plans. And then finally, not to sort of bury the lead, but a lot of other good stuff in the policy and sort of teeing up next steps for tools for reducing office supply, our obsolete office supply, everything from continuing to look at uses that fill space to pre-construction switches where a building may be entitled or are guided to be a certain use, such as office, but pre-construction, a new site plan is entered, and we have processes already that went for that. And the question is whether to codify that further. And then a lot of juicy discussions about, well, what's a redevelopment and what's the value of adaptive reuse? But what if you had 3 stories? What category does that put it in? And what is the value of retaining some of the building? Let's say the parking or our first floor podium. What are the values of those? And should those have different processes or ways the board looks at them relative to what full redevelopment that we see? But we also are, because I think it's still an important stream of thought, is we've been asked to sort of say, well, shouldn't the overall policy also direct just getting rid of office buildings by whatever means is important, and even redevelopment? But we also know that's a much more complex discussion of how we do incentive-based zoning, but it's certainly on there. And then, so that's the broader study. So don't look for that to happen very quickly, but I think a large public discussion about it may happen into next year and beyond. And then beyond land use, we also have looking at some financial incentives, although not a priority. And I added in, based on conversations through various folks in the county and outside the county, another policy statement looks at public-private partnerships, potential source to look at for incentivizing not only adaptive reuse and other forms of repurposing office buildings, but also maybe getting more of what we want out of those buildings. So with that said, I will now hand it off to Jill, who will go through the zoning ordinance.
Sure. So I think Mark alluded to it, but the purpose of the proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance itself is to really effectuate the policy, put it into practice. So in doing so, looking at establishing a new category of site plan amendments. So as Mark pointed out, sort of this is almost like, would say, Goldilocks. Not this, it's not this, it's not this, and this is just right. So I think thinking through it that way, we're not treating it as a major, we're not treating it as a minor, but we're treating this as its own special thing of an adaptive reuse amendment. But establishing some criteria, findings, and standards associated with this. So again, I think there was a question in the initial request to advertise about putting a definition, but in looking at the construct of the zoning ordinance right now, we do not sort of define specifically in our list of definitions what a major site plan amendment is or what a minor site plan amendment is. Rather, in the text of the zoning ordinance, it's very descriptive of what it is and is not. So based on that, and this can be found on lines 44 through 73 of the, I think the link that you received on the proposed zoning ordinance amendment. Language of sort of what qualifies a project as an adaptive reuse amendment. So one, we're making certain that you get one bite of this apple, quite truthfully, and it's the one time that you can use this particular adaptive reuse amendment process. That the principal use of the building is at least 50% office. Again, looking at this, what is this public good? What is this public purpose? And that the building itself has been occupied for at least 5 years. So we're looking at, when were the COs for tenancy issued, and ensuring that it's been established. We recognize that there may have been some that have been vacant, but at least there had been a CO issued for that building. So again, not getting into the sort of switch, but it's been constructed. And then that more than 50% of that office space would be, again, getting to that public priority, moving that needle. The increased density would comply with the proposed, it was 1559D in the text that you received. It said one that I was excited and I put the extra one. It's just 1559D. And that all, as Mark pointed out, that all previous conditions of the approved site have been met, and that getting into what does not qualify Just sort of slide right across is that the reduction of commitments required by previous county board approvals would not be changing. But there are several other things that wouldn't qualify this. Again, this is for ensuring that the roof line itself isn't changing. We recognize that there might be additional amenity space added to mechanical penthouses or existing penthouses, but the intent for this specific adaptive reuse amendment process is that we're not adding additional floors above the existing roof line. That it would not be an adaptive reuse amendment if the increased floor area is achieved through additions greater than 2 stories above the finished grade. So they're really adding all around. That there would be vacation or amendments to existing public easements, or again, this sort of channels in with the previous commitments that were required, that there would be any change to affordable housing, please, sustainable design, or other public priorities that were provided for by the approved site plan. So I think all in all, just understanding too, Mark pointed this out, these are site plan projects. These are not by right projects. So in going through this section, and 15.5 really deals with site plans in Arlington County, how they're defined, how they're processed, how they're reviewed, and how the board makes their findings and can approve additional heights and densities. One element of this is our affordable dwelling unit section, and what we're saying is for this proposed amendment, clarifying what it is and how the affordable dwelling unit requirements are applied. So lines 153 to 155 really talk about this, and what we're proposing reflects the proposed policy that the reduction of obsolete office buildings is a public priority. We are clarifying that adaptive reuse amendments are similar to rehabilitation or renovation of development. Those 2 categories are not subject to the affordable dwelling unit requirements, and therefore we're saying because this is similar and it's more like a rehabilitation or renovation, they're making that clarification. And this gets a little bit more into where the board may have the ability to apply additional height and or additional density. So in lines 319 to 341 of the proposed text, the board will have to make several findings when a project is being proposed. One is that they're finding that the proposal and the additional height and or density is consistent with the change of use. So from office either to residential or another type of use, likely of hospitality, that it reflects the overall reinvestment in the building. Again, it's improving the building inside and out. And finally, that it is enhancing the public realm. It's making not only the building better, but the place around it better. So the types of additional height or density, I think Mark already alluded to. One, it's a little bit wonky, but the density that could be above the underlying zoning district. For those of you that have dabbled in various zoning districts, the underlying district may have an FAR for the office, and then the corresponding residential is a units per acre, and we don't want that to be a hiccup there, and that there could be smaller units, more units, so it could actually trigger, it could be over the units an acre, but we're saying the building size is changing. We don't want to get that plugged up. That certain rooftop uses that were not necessarily included in the approved site plan or were previously excluded. So again, this is the rooftop amenity space. Changing it from an office to a residential building, they might have the opportunity to put a grilling station or some sort of gathering space on the rooftop. In doing so, you're having a gathering, so you need bathrooms or facilities, etc. Building facade changes that might affect exterior wall widths. I'm a little bit outside of my lane, but I do know that there's some, I think, I'm going to look at you, there are some facades that you may put on that when it's put on, you're adding an inch to a couple inches to that exterior, which then all of a sudden, because that's the edge of your wall, your GFA changes. So we want to make certain that that can be accommodated, and we're not saying, well, you've increased by X, and how do we manage that? Again, as mentioned too, the additions to or enlargement of the building not exceeding 2 stories above the finished grade. So this is an idea of looking at small bump outs for infills where there might be arcades, to really take a building that might be dated, especially with some arcades and cutouts, and filling that in and moving a building maybe closer to the sidewalk and making a better public space. The ability to have some mezzanine spaces, the addition of covered, have it highlighted here, enclosed balconies or terraces. If they're uncovered, we don't count that. As soon as they get enclosed, and it might be an idea, they do get counted. Mark did highlight this one is the conversion of gross parking area to gross square footage. We've seen projects where, again, the parking was built to a very high standard for the office building. It's converted to residential. There have been improvements over time to the transportation network and how people travel. And they were able to take some of those parking spaces and make them into storage units, for example. And then finally, sort of a catch-all, because I'm not smart enough to guess everything, is that if the board makes the findings that are similar to those above, there may be other increases in density that are of similar purposes and level of impact. I think we're going to go, so that sort of wraps it all up for what the zoning ordinance amendment is. It was a lot of talking, but if you actually look at it, it's not too much writing in the zoning ordinance. I think you wanted to talk about next steps and how do we pull the thread through all of this?
Yeah, and I apologize in advance. I got started and then I forgot my plan was to give you guys time to talk individually about different things, but I think we can handle it. So just wanted to give a shout out to the admin regulations, the guidelines, which we're actively working on as staff, and we'll have some more to share later this month into next month. But again, the submittal checklist being probably the most important, getting that started. And then the process and timing, we'll talk about in a second relative to the commission's role, and then the standards and site plan conditions, which some of you know, we have standard site plan conditions that go into every site plan, and we'll be looking at those and sort of saying what are appropriate for different use. So I want to leave this at the end, at the request of the co-chairs, to sort of talk about what the role of the PC is in these, looking at these projects as they come forward. This is not necessarily, obviously, this part of the process, which is getting the policy and ordinance changes done. And then finally, just for for everyone's knowledge, sort of where we are, I've had, a fairly robust community engagement, having gone to from a first lunch and learn over the summer, a second lunch and learn actually this Thursday, as sort of public presentations and moderated Q&A. We obviously had the RTA in September, went to LRPC, which I referenced several times, on September 24th. We released the draft policy and the zoning text on October 1st. And since we've been to the Economic Development Commission, the Housing Commission, this meeting tonight, we had the lunch and learn on Thursday, and then have a meeting with C2, E2 on October 8th, and perhaps a transportation meeting that night as well. We're trying to balance that. And then obviously into the commission and board hearing scheduled for November. So with that said, we've been talking, so we're really here to hear your conversation and here to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Jill and Mark. Okay, so I think the way I'm going to do this, I've got a couple like buckets of things. I'm going to kind of frame this out, and then I'm interested around the table, as well as we got Commissioner Steinberger online. And then if we want to kind of bracket things, we can, or we can just kind of go around robin. So I think we definitely want to talk about process, and we want to revisit a couple of those slides Mark pulled up. Those are helpful. I think I'd like to save that till the end, but process really undergirds, maybe that's the term, kind of what we're talking about here, because my view of it is basically what we're talking about is trying to possibly, or at least make it easier for folks who hold these buildings currently to do something different. We don't want these vacant office buildings just sitting there, not creating tax revenue, not creating anything productive for the communities. What can we do? So what they're getting in exchange is we're trying to put together a process that's predictable, that's streamlined, that's quicker. So part of that speaks to public process, public engagement, right? And focusing that. So let's do that at the end. I had a couple substantive questions, but let's do process at the end. Do other folks around the table have substantive questions? Because maybe we could just do that, and then we'll go and talk about process. Because I think process really speaks to not just the community at large, and we can have input on that, but also planning commission. Because Mark was talking about SPRCs. Maybe we wouldn't even call it that, but I think we let's maybe put our heads together. So when we report back to the planning commission colleague, we can kind of give our thoughts on what that may look like. And that also might inform kind of staff discussions. So I'm happy to go first, but if other folks have substantive questions, maybe let's do those now.
I had some clarification.
All right, why don't you do those first and then we'll go.
It's a little bit of a list, so I don't want to jump too far if other people are.
I'll cut you off.
All right, perfect. So just sort of talking about architecture and the zoning and some of this stuff, if I can organize my thinking here. Again, to go back to the definition of obsolete, right? So how do we understand these buildings, and are we foreseeing essentially it being strictly office to residential / hotel? Is this the only use that we're thinking of changing, or could it go the other way? Can we have some sort of residential start to become gyms or some other sort of project? And then does this encompass and foresee that? Let me go through the questions, and that way we can all sort of discuss it. The other thing was sort of what entails a repurposing. We were talking about 50% office. Is that after the repurpose has happened, or is that just a requirement? And then do we have to retain 50% office as we go? And finally,
why don't you stop there? That was a lot.
Okay.
You have two big questions.
Yeah, all right.
So I'll take the first one, Joe, you can take the second. I think in terms of other uses, we had a lot of conversations about how do we create some sort of very easily defined sort of guardrails around this process. And so we did settle in, and really consistent with CMRI is, okay, we want to look at office first, and really want to focus on office, given the mission of the initiative. And then we really wanted to think about changing that for office to alternative uses. Now, I think the alternative uses are pretty much any use allowed under that zoning district. So certainly people could use it for a variety of things. I think the market, what we're seeing is residential and hotel are probably the ones we're hearing the most about, because one, those are uses that justify the investment. They have the financial backing that when they're successful to pay back the cost, versus more funky uses like arts and things that are great, but those are more difficult to finance. And we have often talked about temporary spaces, and we have a lot of stuff working on that. But yeah, so it's generally office to alternative use. We haven't asked, well, what about a residential building that wants to be this, or what about a hotel that wants to be a residential building, as we've seen in the county? And while we certainly understand that there are maybe some people have concerns about those processes, we thought we'd muddy the waters way too much by trying to bring in all that. And a lot of the work being done under our MMA work, the major, minor, administrative, that Jill and Nick can talk to much more, is looking at those sort of things. But are there processes that could be streamlined that are having less impact on a community than our neighborhood than others? So, but this one's really just focused on the office to alternative uses.
So is that a guardrail?
That is a guardrail.
It's only office repurposing.
Yes.
That would be coming in front
Now,
of it.
if in 2 years everyone says it's a great success, let's write a policy on expanded. That's great.
Because the principal purpose has to be at least 50% office space.
Yeah, so that can, Jill can answer.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about that. So yeah, so again, we're establishing this as this public purpose of why do we want to do this, and we recognize that to start turning or right sizing our office market, we need to do a couple of things, and one is just reducing the supply. And so we're saying, you have to have at least 50% to access this particular type of amendment process. It doesn't preclude anybody that might have 20%
Sure.
to go through either, depending on what they're doing, a major site plan amendment or a minor site plan amendment. So there's still options. This is just a very narrow look of sort of why are we doing this? We are doing this for a very specific public purpose to achieve this. And these are why we've established these criteria. So again, if you don't meet these criteria, that's fine. You can do other, and you sort of are afforded other ends of a spectrum.
I mean, this is not a form-based code, but it's sort of the same, a similar approach. You fit into this box, you meet this narrow criteria, you do these things, you pass go, and you get a simplified process. You can choose to do a site plan or something else major if you want, but if you want to go through this process, you can do it this way. Right?
It's very prescriptive of sort of what it is, and then also what it is not.
Sure.
And again, a lot of that, the sort of the what it is not, was also trying to constrain major changes that could be major changes to the community at large. A change to the previously committed benefits associated with it,
right?
Or changes that getting rid of vacations and easements that folks have been used to. So I think really there's a couple of different ways that you can look at it. One is the public policy, but two, how does it impact the rest, the sort of the environment that it sits within?
And I'm going to interrupt you real quick, and then I'll call on you. I think, and that speaks to process, which I think we want to talk about at the end, because one of the things I think we want to have a conversation of is that public, engagement process. And if there's a little committee here and public's involved, so I've been on PC for 18 months, right? And I've understood the value of SPRCs and the level of input the community can provide. And early on, you can shape a project, right? And staff's very good at articulating, here's community benefits, here's ways in which the public can have input and kind of, whatever. Here, I'm just thinking ahead, I'm giving you a sneak preview of my thoughts. Like, we just want to be clear of, it's a limited scope, like you're saying, Jill. So to what extent, could public input influence at all, given that limited scope? So I think that's what I want to talk about in 10 minutes, because I think if we're going to tell, if the county's going to tell the public, hey, we're going to have a process, we do need to provide an expectation of kind of what amount of input they can provide and what impact they can have, versus them saying, well, whatever, like that was kind of a waste of time, right? I don't think anybody here wants to do that. So I think it's just kind of expectation setting. But
and I think one important thing is as you talk about the process for us all to remember is that as I mentioned before, we did look at administrative pathways, and
sure,
one of the reasons why we didn't do that was the legal. The other is that may really degrade any public knowledge, right? And I think the fact that this will always end in a county board vote, by definition, already brings a fair amount of process advertisement to it. And the question is then sort of what on top of that is typical to our experience.
Well, and it's obvious, it's a novel thing. Like, if this happens, it will be kind of novel and it will be newsworthy and people will be interested. And I'm sure folks will want to have input. And if we get in a lucky position where it's old hat and a regular thing, then great, maybe we can make it a purely administrative process. You had another question.
So just quick reaction to that. So I think that's why I'm focusing a little bit on this idea of guardrails and or making sure that this doesn't get abused, since we're essentially foregoing a lot of public oversight where we're talking about possibly, right? So that's when then like, okay, fair enough, we're going to let this streamline through. But here are the final question I had was the 5-year certificate of occupancy. And I'm guessing that, just to clarify then again, I didn't quite understand. You can't apply if you've had 6 years of occupancy was the last, like, I wasn't quite sure.
So the idea is that you had at least, so the building has been sort of in existence.
Yeah. And that's
for
to
at least
prevent
5 years.
4-year-old bailiff to come here and start to apply for a
Yeah.
repurpose. Okay.
Yeah.
And that was the other question. So that's where I got thinking, like, I know that like on ADA regulations, if you do a certain amount, like I think it's 20% of investment into a building, you then have to bring it up to code, right? If it's below that. So should we start to think about something like that? And the idea here is to mitigate, like, for instance, a residential tower coming through and then closing their balconies and sort of adding FAR, but sort of sneaking under the radar when that's really not the intent. It wasn't just to augment existing buildings that are doing well. It really is an incentive to try to get buildings that are struggling and or obsolete, as the term.
Yeah, building office buildings. So that's gonna be the key. So the idea of minor, what we call minor amendments or major amendments, and how that's determined in administrative review is already a separate worksheet, but collaborating with this for that very reason, which is that which things are, as we look at the, so what goes to the PC, what doesn't go to the PC is one thing that is in our minor and major, right, processes. So I think that's where, you know, the 50% rule is meant to really reflect the principal use of the building was office. And it is to reflect upon someone saying, well, I have 400 square feet office in my second floor. I want to use this process to convert from hotel to residential, right? Because that's not that that's not maybe a worthy project. That's not the intent of this effort.
Tony, you look like you.
I do. So I have a couple of in the weeds. So when it comes to these, the adaptive reuse amendment, section B there, line 44 to 73. I like all of the ones in section 2.
You're looking at the text of this.
The zoning bill. I like all of those in the latter half, but I am a little hesitant on some of those in the first half. That sort of all the criteria that they have to meet in order to be eligible. So I I have some questions on whether this is too restricted.
So just to, I'm sorry, I'm not signed in right now.
Get out like an audio.
Oh, please don't, please don't. Like every time we make Leo do the planning commission motions.
It's a lot, especially this, the zoning ones are really a lot. Great.
I don't.
We saw last time.
Oh, that's right. It's very redundant.
That was my great shining moment. That's when I was the only one who noticed.
It's like, wait.
I did it.
Just keep talking.
Yes. So I guess, Tony, were there ones that you were
Yes.
concerned about?
So subsection A there,
Yeah.
that it has not been previously approved. Is there any reason why we want to limit this to one time? Because I know in other cities, you know, they're able to use buildings many times.
So part of this is the guardrails that we were talking about, and that we don't have a project that, you know, we're saying that they come in once and they convert 51%. Then, you know, so we go through the process, they get a short review. They come in again and they make some more changes, and they come in again. So the idea is this happens one time. And we really do want property owners to make that decision. One, because we're truncating a process. Two, really to get at that sort of that public purpose of really removing. So I think if we're slowly, you know, sort of dripping and drabbing, I'm not certain if it's fully. If we're fully achieving that, if we allow them to constantly come back and.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm just thinking because I remember a friend of mine, Cleveland actually, and he was in downtown and he was in this former office building that's been around since the 1860s. And I don't know if it makes sense to limit this to one go. I mean, maybe potentially there's an option where we limit it to once every 20 years or 30 years, something along those lines. But I think just full stop saying you're done, one and done, that's it. That's
Well,
So,
the 5-year rule can't in on this?
and if there's still office there, and so if they still have, I think this is where it gets challenging though. Because you're saying you have to have 50% or more if they've already changed,
They already changed it.
you know, if they've changed it.
I
It's
see.
not precluding them from going through a major site plan amendment or a minor site plan amendment. It still can be changed. We're just sort of offering this one-time deal of the the adaptive reuse amendment.
Yeah.
Because of it, it is somewhat, has this incentive, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the big carrot. I don't mean to cut you off, but that's the big carrot you're dangling, right? And to speak for myself here, we're hoping some folks take us up on it. We don't know. A lot of this is factors beyond the county's control. It's the financial viability of these uses. And so it's our job, in my opinion, to figure out the county side, but then they're going to figure out whether it's viable. And if they want to do more, I agree with Jill. I mean, I think one time is fine, because if it's more than that, then that's sort of what a major or minor, like that's what that process is for then. We need to have more broad, this is my view, community engagement, right? And thinking about that, especially since what we're giving up is saying, well, our sector plan says that this particular block is going to really turn over in the next 20 years, and we're going to cut off the super block, or we're going to do this and that, green ribbon, all these different things, right? And we're going a little that in the interim for reuse. And I'm with you. I think reuse is great, because we should, not tear everything down, but it is kind of a push and a pull.
Well, here's a scenario. I own a building, right? Not doing very well. So I come up to Jill and Mark and I say, hey, I want to turn about 30% of this building into residential, top 4 floors. It turns out to be really successful. So then I come back and I say, can I finish
No dice.
the other 20%
Right.
under the same process? Does that rub you the wrong way?
I mean, I think then you have to go through, we're a little bit, because we are giving up like a public process. Like, we're still kind of going to figure out what that kind of looks like, right?
Right, but they're not exceeding.
Right.
The
final
guide
result would
rails.
be no different than had they done it all in one.
Right, and they're sort of dipping their toes,
I
right?
know, but it is an administrative burden for staff to have to revisit this.
Well, they'll pay fees.
Well, I understand, but
So just to confirm, I think the 30%, we're saying you have to change at least 50% to be eligible. So at least 50%. So I think it depends on how you do the math. At least 50% of the building as it exists has to be office. And of that, you have to change it at least 50%. So it might work out.
Okay, so that's where I'm a little confused.
So
then.
there's an eligibility requirement to apply,
You have to commit.
but then
There's
the process necessitates a type of improvement.
Yeah, and I think the scale of what we're talking about from these buildings are all site plan buildings. I wouldn't say it would be unusual for someone to come in and sort of do it incrementally every 5 years, right? Once you take the building, you sort of say, I need this plumbing for these floors, I need this, let's do it up, versus sort of saying 3 years later, I may turn 5 more floors, because of the fit out that is required to change the use is so more significant than just an office fit out.
scale.
Yeah.
About the guts.
Yeah, you want to put the plumbing all the way up and have the right. I think what this has raised, or we can go back and look at it, is, which I only thought of it right this second, so that's why these conversations are great, is that what happens if someone comes in and gets a site plan approved but doesn't act upon it, right? And because financing fell through, or because they had a different idea, I think we have to look at that, because that's not the intent of the one. It's not the intent to sort of say, you had a good idea, but things happened broader, didn't allow the market. It's still a vacant office building. You want to come in 3 years later and sort of tweak that plan. I think we still want to allow that.
Yeah, and that was gonna be my second question, is that 5-year,
Yeah.
is that 5-year window, blanket anything, more recent than 5 years is a no-go? Does that warrant a special exception?
Yeah,
On that.
yeah.
Well, to confirm, so I clarify, I think what I was hearing first was that for B1A is that it could have gone through the process, but they stopped. They received the entitlements, but then they never went through with the construction. It was never, that particular amendment was never sort of vested, let's just say. And what I was hearing you say is like, maybe if they want to come back and make some additional changes, but because they just never made it happen. Could that happen? No,
Yeah,
that's
and I think,
more-
I think particularly something about if someone came in good faith, did the work for residential conversion to an office building, it just fell through for whatever reasons. 5 years later, someone came back and said, I want to do a hotel. Well, that's a significantly different plan. And we still want that to be streamlined because we still have the vacant office building as the problem. So I think that's where we're trying to, well, figure out how to fit that into language so it makes sense. I think what we're trying to stop is someone sort of saying, I used it 10 years ago. Can I get my minor done differently? We don't want to create a separate class of buildings that has a different process around them. Really a process that is a different process, right? So I think that was really the initial intent of, okay, you get one bite of the apple, is that you don't get to be a special class of building that has a different pathway to administrative or minor or site plan changes throughout the life of your building. You know, get all the big stuff out of the way, and then you go back into the normal MMA process, major, minor, administrative process.
But to then clarify, when you were saying, well, what if they do something and they opened up their doors and it's not, they're just not able to lease it at all. And so I think what you're saying is, why do we have to wait for 5 years? Why can't they just make the change? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, when you're talking the initial sort of, this sort of one-time thing, is the 5 years this, I don't know, my question was, is that too cautionary? Is that period too long to wait before we allow a conversion from office to residential?
So we had a lot of discussion about this,
Yeah.
and I think part of it was in the policy, and what we want to say publicly is we still want to not lose a message of that we still very much think growth, dynamic growth in our office sector is important. We'll get new buildings will attract tenants. The idea that new high quality office space is obsolete is not the direct connection we're trying to make. So the idea would be, well, if it's less than 5 years, you probably built an office building that's least competitive, right? Now, we've had examples in the county where that didn't happen. Just one or two that I can remember off the top of my head where a building came out of the chute and just was not competitive. It just missed a window of whatever sort of upgrades that were typical of the market. And to your point is, well, would we want to preclude that from someone saying, it's year 2 and I know that I can't lease this office space? I think it's worthy of a discussion. I think there'll probably be so few of those that we'll see. But also it sort of begs the question, this is, we talked about time. A lot of people have exact years and we were sort of saying, we don't do that. And so this is definitely one that we're sort of have still internal discussion about. How does it really make a difference to us?
And I will say that if I'm remembering correctly, there are 6 sort of pending applications that are out there. And if you know 2 cases of this sort of thing, weird kind of thing happening where it's unleased, you have 6 total. That's a big chunk of.
Yeah, but these are all older buildings that are sort of in our sort of knowledge pipeline of what no one's delivering a new building as of yet and sort of saying, I'm giving up on office 3 years later, right? They're generally competitive and can attract tenants.
I want to get, I want to get to Commissioner Weir. I'll get you, but I want to get he's had his hand up for quite a while.
Okay.
Yeah, Commissioner Weir.
1 second, sorry. So, I guess if I'm understanding correctly, if I'm reading this correctly, it's tied to the certificate of occupancy, right? So I don't think that we need to worry about the concern about someone getting the entitlement and then trying to run out the 5 years or even and then saying, can I get a change through this process? Because you get the CO after everything is built, if I remember everything correctly, right? Like that's the last thing. But as far as this sort of nightmare scenario where they get the CO and they just don't get any tenants, building built on spec or built for a certain tenant, and then the tenant goes away. It seems to me, and I'm curious to know what staff's thinking about this, it seems to me extremely unlikely that a developer is going to redo all their floor plates and plumbing and electrical within like 5 years seems like a really short amount of time to make that expensive in an investment. And my apologies if this is was just being discussed, but I'm curious to know what staff's thinking about that, are there any circumstances where the nightmare scenario would actually pencil? I'm gonna go back on mute and hear what y'all think.
Yeah, no, I think you must have been reading our minds. Yeah, we agree with you that it's very, very, very unusual for a builder to build a Class A office building and several years later say, there's just no demand for office in this type of building. I think we would generally see those as very competitive buildings competing for tenants. And it's not really the purpose of this sort of obsolete. I think there's, as with anything, there's probably a million different scenarios we can imagine that don't quite fit into this box. And we always said, well, if that comes along, we'll fix it then, right? Like, what happens if it's half under construction and someone changes their mind? What do we do then? I think until we see that, I think trying to build a sort of what if scenario gets so, it kind of loses them. It gets so convoluted that it loses the message of what we actually think is going to be more norm. So I think all
Well,
those things.
But I'm sorry to interrupt. Something that's under construction isn't going to have its CO, right? And so we've not even gotten close to that 5-year trigger, right?
Yeah, but so it wouldn't have any, it wouldn't apply. I guess that's the point is under this, it would not be eligible at all. Someone may go to say, do you want to deliver the vacant office building and let it sit for 5 years, or would you rather just maybe make the change now? I think that's very, very unlikely to sort of see happen.
And in that circumstances, if it was a real true nightmare scenario, like if it's so bad, then, you know, they may very well need to sell to it another applicant who has the finances to go through an option that is available to them, which is the standard site plan condition amendment process, correct? Like if it's so bad, it's that bad, they probably aren't getting out of that hole. They're probably someone selling the asset and someone is getting it out for them.
I'll even be someone bold and say, if that happens, the person we're talking to is not the original developer of that project. The person that started the construction is no longer the developer of that, because it's probably gone back to a bank. It's probably worked out. Yeah, I think anyone that is a developer that's got financing is going to build the building that they got the financing for.
I guess what I'm getting at for the benefit of my colleagues is just my strong suspicion that there are a lot of zeros that are sort of protecting us from the consequences of bad faith utilization of this. It seems to me like under most circumstances, it would be extremely expensive to use this in bad faith. And what I'm trying to think through, and now I'm going to switch it back to staff, is like, you know, how, and then I am going to really shut up to the chairs. Like what are some circumstances, and maybe this is for when it comes to the commission, you know, like what are some ways that we should be thinking about that this could be, that some of these concerns could actually happen. But I'm gonna yield back because I've got some issues that I've got to deal with. So my apologies and thanks.
Do you want to take that in terms of
I think with the circumstances, I think there would be far and few. I like the term that there are many zeros backing this up with respect to the investment. And I think Commissioner Weir did point it out that, you know, should something catastrophic happen, we do have remedies through a major site plan amendment or a minor site plan amendment process, you know, as they currently exist. You know, I think if the building was being built for a specific tenant and something happened to that specific tenant, I think you would see a lot of changes coming in, some maybe administrative, some minor site plan amendments, some maybe major in sort of, and I think in the policy, Mark has sort of described, this is that initial step, but there are other steps of how do we improve the offices. So if a project was being built for a very specific tenant and they had certain parameters that were unique to that tenant, my guess is they would be coming back to us through a separate process to make changes to likely the interior of the building to make it more palatable to a wider variety of tenants. So I think, you know, that could be one of those catastrophic events that could happen, like, oh my gosh, we just lost a certain tenant. But they have remedies to fix it, to make it more attractive to others.
One quick, is there any reason why the balconies have to be enclosed?
That was just, if there are balconies and they want to have them enclosed for whatever reason, some of our older office buildings, they actually have some terraces. But if they want to be enclosed, that as soon as you enclose it, that's GFA. And we want to ensure that if it makes sense for a building, or if they're reskinning or something, that makes sense for the building, that could be something that the county board can approve.
Yeah, so think of it the opposite. We're not saying don't do unenclosed balconies. We're saying if you want to do enclosed, there's a method for you to do.
Got it. Okay.
All right, so let's do this. I have one substantive question, which I know you covered at the Housing Commission, but I think my colleagues, or at least my other planning commission colleagues, would appreciate it. And Mark, maybe this is probably for you. Can you just explain again why we're proposing to exclude this from the affordable dwelling requirements?
So Jill referenced one of them, is that currently the ordinance language excludes renovation or rehabilitation as defined activities within the zoning ordinance, and that excludes that from the ADU. And certainly, I think on the spectrum of what you can do to a building, this feels a lot closer to renovation, rehabilitation in many ways than, say, true redevelopment, where you're tearing things down. I think second is because the density isn't changing. The ADU typically looks at sort of what your base density is and uses the calculation up to that, and then sort of says, okay, what is your extraordinary density? And that is put into the community benefits package, right? If there's affordable housing part of that, a way to earn density. So our going in assumption was either these buildings have already paid their ADU, or if the ADU didn't exist at the time, they paid what was required of them at the time. And that going back in history and sort of saying you should pay twice or you should pay now, didn't feel like something that one would garner a significant amount of resources to the county, but probably cause a lot more obstacles on sort of the projects moving forward on this end. So that was sort of but I think the first one is probably the most clean, is that zoning has already seen that sort of renovation rehabilitation aren't sort of a source to go back and sort of recheck the ADU.
No, and I agree with that analysis, but I think it's worth articulating the record. I listened to great conversation with the Housing Commission, all those guys. And we always want to think about affordable housing. My concern here, other than the fact that we've already done the community benefits, and that's one of them, would be disincentivizing building housing. That's sort of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
By imposing that requirement.
Yeah.
And I think it came up during the Housing Commission, and I think more for the LRPC piece is understanding that none of the policy precludes a property owner from providing affordable housing in the project. This is just saying it's not required, so it doesn't preclude.
Yeah, the expectations of the ordinance would not exist here.
I would posit, and I'm not a super outspoken defender of developers usually, but I would posit that, taking a building that's obsolete, right, and repurposing it is in a way a sort of a community benefit inherently.
Yeah.
And I think this is why it's a little more palatable for me to expedite the process, because there is a community benefit. So the fact that we're not extracting further community benefits from them in this particular instance doesn't sort of rub me the wrong way.
See Commissioner Weir online, and then if we can talk about process, because I think that might take us a few minutes. Commissioner Weir.
Yeah, thank you. I guess maybe just confirm this for me, but my understanding on this requirement that there not be, or excuse me, this lack of a requirement for an additional affordable housing contribution is the idea here. To what extent is the idea here that this building has already taken steps to mitigate the additional density when it was initially built, right? And so we're operating, we're to the extent that the changes operate within the additional quanta of density that the that was initially built, 30, 40 years ago, that there isn't a need for additional site plan mitigation. To what extent is that the thinking, or am I sort of misunderstanding some of the rationale at play here?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of those legs of the stool of that overall discussion is that the base density that's been approved already went through that process of looking at the impacts of that building and used whatever tools were available at that time to mitigate. And obviously, since other studies into next year will look at what if you add more significant density, those will be more apropos discussions of how you mitigate that quote unquote additional density. But this is really sort of nominal density increases to the base. So yes, that's absolutely correct. That was sort of the basic starting off point of our discussion in terms.
Okay, I would just posit then that we be able to think about have mechanisms in place to ask ourselves, do we need different infrastructure if we are mitigating the density for 100 meat cows as opposed to the density needed for 100 dairy cows? And the answer is, in some meaningful ways, yes, right? It's not necessarily the quantum of mitigation changes, right? The bottom line might not change, but the tools that you need to mitigate 100 apple trees aren't the same as the tools you need to mitigate 100 orange trees. Pick your metaphor, but we have to have some way of asking. And I agree with the underlying rationale there, but I think that we do need to have a way of asking whether or not the kind of mitigation that was put into place is going to be sufficient once this is a residential building. And I'll just leave it at that.
Maybe that's a good segue to talk about process. There was a slide, I don't know which one, if we can back up. Not that, although that one's really helpful. No, keep going back. Let's see here. Keep going back. No, I think maybe this. Nope. Actually, that was it. No, go back to. Yeah, go back.
With the red arrow.
I think that's it. Yeah. No, it was the red arrow. There we go. Okay, cool. So I don't know if this necessarily encompasses it, but so I think we want to talk about what does process look like, and especially from the community engagement standpoint. That's sort of our area of expertise right here, LRPC, ZOCO, and then thinking about SPRC, Planning Commission can have our conversation about that. So one of the questions I have, and staff, please feel free to weigh in. So we're, as Jill was describing, we're creating a narrow box. And if you're going to fit through it with this policy, then great. To me, if there's going to be a public engagement, there needs to be opportunities for meaningful input and for that input to influence and possibly modify. So if we have a very prescriptive policy, I'm less compelled. We have other ways of doing kind of engagement, kind of in a broad sense. So I guess I'm looking here. These do look like possible topic areas where public engagement may provide useful when we're reviewing a scenario, like we're reviewing a project, an adaptive reuse situation. I'm thinking out loud here a little bit. I welcome my fellow commissioners to weigh in here. So thinking about process, I think what I would like to see is us kind of define the scope, and it doesn't have to be an all-encompassing list, but the types of things, I think this is a great list right here, of things in which the community may engage on and have a meaningful impact, right? If we do like a meeting, I would recommend we don't even call it SPRC. I think it's called something else. And I think we think about whether maybe a meeting for a particular proposal is necessary or not, and maybe that's something that we leave at the discretion of the SPRC chair or something. So I'm unpacking a few things there. And then the other thought I have, and I would welcome your thoughts, is defining kind of what that engagement is like. And if we're having a meeting, are we responding to a questionnaire? Like with us with site plans, right? We do a questionnaire, right? So are we going to have that? Because typically the first meeting is then, okay, here's what we learned so far, right? We're teeing things up for a second meeting. So I think here we need to have a more of an expectation of, here's everything we have. Here's what we know at this point. Here are the 2 or 3 things since, we've posted materials or folks have known about this project that have changed. yes or no, and then we can solicit questions. And that's kind of it, maybe as far as like a public meeting. Because this only works, I think, in kind of your view of this, if we get to that like 120 day-ish, I know that's not set in stone, but the 120 day timeframe, right? Which means in a sequencing kind of scenario, you need to figure out that meeting kind of quick, right? And what that's going to look like and what you want engagement to look like. So I have a lot of thoughts there. I'm going to take a pause and would be interested in other commissioners.
I guess on a slightly different, so, to put sort of ideas on the table. One of the possibilities we discussed last time was the notion of no public meeting whatsoever, right? So let's say we do an online engagement session, and then we essentially have a subcommittee of the SPRC, where 2 members of the Planning Commission review the process with a meeting with staff and sort of go over the issues and see if the community's intent have been met, and then it just goes straight to the Planning Commission. And then sort of like, as Jill mentioned, on a consent agenda type approach. That would be, I think, another sort of potential pathway. And that's why at the earlier part of the conversation, I was really obsessing about guardrails, because then that would make that public review process right now, right? So now we're reviewing the process and we're saying, here are the guardrails and here are the things that we value, and this is what I'm wondering, if we have to have a set of guidelines that go with the zoning changes that would spell out or further explain what the community's concern are, pointing to the slide. So that's sort of, I think, one possible process idea.
If can I react to that or ask? So if we did that approach, you would, and again, I think, because, for the record, I think we all are members of the public, right? The 4 of us, Commissioners Steinberg. So we obviously all value public engagement. We know what that's like. I think we also take seriously the engagement in those site plan conversations, and what that looks like. So I think there's a lot of care there, right? In all of our conversations here, but we're trying to balance that with how can we basically provide a process that incentivizes some of these property owners to do something more productive with their property. Okay, so that being said, so with what you're saying, Leo, so maybe that's like, that's like a committee of 2 or whatever. If it's like the SPRC chair, LRPC chair, whoever is deputized, they can discuss with staff offline and see where things are. And then if you're teeing it up for like a planning commission meeting, would you still do like a presentation and a discussion, or like a
Right, so that's
PC?
the part that I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And I don't really, but it was just a thought. And I think what that would do then, it would be sort of like almost like a committee report. You come in, you do your 5-10 minute presentation, you say, here's what we discussed, here are our findings, here's sort of the general recommendations that we have. The commission then talks about it, not very long, it gets voted, and then goes to the county board. And this is essentially by way of skipping the scheduling difficulty of the SPRCs, where we have to get rooms available and whatnot.
So that's the biggest thing. And again, I don't like, I want to be sensitive because I don't want to put staff on, I don't want to put you on the spot as far as, describing challenges with community processes. But I, myself can say, I know scheduling is a big issue, and sequencing schedules and figuring out meeting times. And maybe with Leo's proposal, like you're saying, that alleviates it. If it's just basically being able to do something, quick with 1 or 2 members of the planning commission, and then the planning commission meetings themselves, there's a case that's predictable. It's on a calendar, and you can do a brief presentation. I do think I was leaning towards kind of expedited process, like even less process, but I'm thinking, especially if we get a few of these, I think the county board probably would appreciate a little bit more of a thorough conversation from PC, at least at the beginning of this, right? As they kind of think about this too. And we can always revisit it and kind of narrow that if we don't think there's a value.
Well, and I think we can also play it by ear. Sorry, Tony. You can raise your hand up, and I'm just talking. I'm co-chair, so I get.
Great power
No,
means great
I was-
responsibility.
I was just queuing myself in the line there.
Yeah, but I think, and again, I think at the last meeting, I expressed this very strongly that, I feel our SPRC process are very effective and very, very streamlined. And I think any more streamlining out of this, and we're starting to, cut more than fat. But I think, in this situation, we can also play it by ear, given how busy the schedule is. So I think right now we're not seeing quite as many SPRCs come through, right? We probably could schedule a meeting somewhat quickly. So I think, although that leaves a little bit of unclarity on the process, so maybe that's not what we want. But again, I'm just batting ideas around.
No, I mean, I think, I don't, I don't know that we have to be, this is maybe for you, Mark. I don't think we have to be wed to a super prescriptive process, but we
Okay.
want some idea of the direction we're going in administratively.
Yeah, I think, and again, the good news is that we generally capture this in administrative regulations, so it doesn't go to zoning ordinance.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that this will be a flowing conversation, right? And the admin can change.
Yeah.
Relatively quickly, while county board can't change zoning ordinance nearly as quickly. But yes, I think the general approach from staff has been for a lot of issues, but in this particular case as well, but let's have the conversation. Let's pick something that feels right the first time. We know the county board hearing is gonna be different the first time than maybe the seventh time or whatever. We know that things will change as people get more used to a process. So I think we can work with you on sort of language that you feel comfortable with in terms of how you want to process. I think they're all interesting ideas. I think, and I think, again, while there is a guardrails that has, into a pretty tight box, it still doesn't mean projects aren't going to vary by two major elements. One is complexity, still complexity within that box. And two is quality of the proposal, right? I think sometimes proposals come in are sort of like, wow, they've done all their work. And sometimes you look and sort of say, there's a lot of questions to ask. So I think from a staff perspective, that's starting at that point, right? Which is what are the questions we have to ask before we can even enter that process. So I think, yeah, we don't want to sort of say this is exactly it, but we also want to sort of say, this is a path forward that if you're looking to make this project, you can go to your backers, your partners and sort of say, we can get this done in 3 or 4 months now versus where it may have taken 12 months before. Whether any of those numbers are exactly right is probably less important than there's a new process to sort of that will significantly streamline it.
Yeah, because and Jill weigh in too if you want. I mean, because even if we did a scenario where it's like, do we need a meeting? Do we not need a meeting? We still have to approve a roster. Remember how that goes, right? At a planning commission meeting, that has to be teed up.
Right.
So we have to kind of know actually pretty early on, even if we're gonna have a quick process, so it's almost like we need to approve a roster and have that ready to go. Maybe not, it's like annoying, but we have to follow these,
So one thing I can offer is LRPC, I mentioned this, that we are planning to do later in the month, leading up to the board discussion, some sort of forums with developers and practitioners. And I can add this to the agenda. It already was, but I can add it in.
Yeah, I
To
think
get
that,
their perspective, which is that what is the real hurdles? I think a lot of the owners or developers that come forward with these projects are gonna have a pretty good plan coming into the concept plan phase. I doubt it's gonna be sort of a back of a napkin. And so I think the question of how quickly they can get into the public engagement process is really a question for them, but maybe they could start right away, right? Because it's not a sort of process that's working out over a period of a year.
right.
Where they said, this is the project and there's not that many moving parts to it. And, so let me ask that question of them as well, and I'll get back to you certainly at the PC.
I think that,
Yes. So on my philosophy on this, there's a sort of spectrum that exists between minor site plan amendment and major site plan amendment. In this process, we're not changing a whole lot. So to be, the use is changing, which is significant. Building itself, that sort of piece of it leans more on the spectrum of minor site. I don't think our role has to be that big. I tend to stray more towards Leo's idea where we have a couple of commissioners who are interested to study it. We post materials, report findings from a couple of our members ahead of time so the full body can look at it before a meeting. I just leave it as a consent agenda item. If anyone has any objections to it, we can discuss it. But other than that, I don't really see there being the need for this kind of full process, because this is not a terribly significant change. There are going to be some significant changes in some ways, but if the whole aim of this is to move it through the process faster, if we start adding on SPRCs, add it into the discussions, requiring presentations in our planning commission meetings, it's kind of defeating the purpose of of a sort of expedited process. I like it as a sort of pass over. All right, are there any problems here? You know, okay, cool. Let's get it to the county board, because the county board is going to have that robust discussion in more detail, and they'll still have reports from us. That's how I see it.
And yeah, go ahead.
And the online engagement, I think, I don't know how my fellow commissioners feel about
Yeah.
that, but do we feel that an online engagement where it's like up to weeks? And I think that doesn't impact our scheduling. We can do that fairly quickly and get some of that community feedback.
Well, where I'm still, it's funny because I've been persuaded to kind of move other side of this conversation a little bit. But where I get hung up a little bit is not just to have meetings, but it's kind of novel. There are folks in neighborhoods, it's not just Crystal City, but I'm thinking Crystal City, right? And other neighborhoods where this would be a big deal. It would be novel. It's a new process for the county, right? So just getting folks to wrap their heads around it, especially those who kind of keep track of these things. And, maybe they were involved in a community benefits conversation 15 years ago. I think it's not just the planning commissioners who are involved in SPRCs. It's representatives from civic associations, other groups, a lot of folks who have kind of an interest. SPRCs are kind of like a whole of the community kind of thing. And so that's where I'm like, I hear that makes sense. That's kind of where I was originally headed. But I just want to make sure that we still have that option, because I think if we get a couple of these, I think we're probably going to want to have some of that for planning commission conversation, definitely for county board. And then if we feel like it's kind of unnecessary, then okay, I think at that point, we can kind of ease off a little bit. So probably just requires, honestly, this is teed up for planning commission discussion when this comes up on the agenda. And I think this is report that we had, some very, polite, I would say disagreement, but kind of just different angles of thinking about this. And obviously, we're going to do some more work on the staff end.
Yeah.
Jill and Mark are.
Yeah, I don't think we're disagreeing.
No. I think we're just grappling with,
right.
Yeah, kind of with this,
What's
what
the
this
right-
looked like, which is really not too dissimilar from your all's conversation. So I think this was productive. So I think that's pretty much it.
One
go
more
ahead.
thing. When we started COVID, remember, we used to have video presentations by staff. And those were very helpful.
Yes.
Maybe, it's a little bit more robust online engagement with the video, both the applicant and,
Yeah.
so it's almost a mini SPRC. It's one way, right?
like a town hall, we
Right.
answer questions, we talk to you, but we're not.
No. When we started COVID, SPRCs were online, so then staff would do a presentation and it was video. So
Okay.
you'd watch the video. Then the applicant would do a video, so you'd watch that video. Then you do the online engagement. Am I remember this correctly?
Yeah, are we still doing it with it?
Okay, and then we do the online. So
Yeah.
by the end of that process, you were fairly well informed.
Yeah.
Of what the application was, what the issues were, and sort of what some of the, sort of different areas. So I think, we can do a fairly robust online. Go ahead.
It's kind of like an online class versus an in-person
Right.
class.
Yeah. It's not ideal, but, it does help us get there fast.
Well, we're 8:45 and I want to allow for any public comment. If we have any public comment online or in person.
So no one's indicated in the chat that they'd like to provide public comment, but as you said, Mr. Chair, now is the time anyone can message, I'm watching the chat as Natasha. Happy to entertain some public comment. Mr. Ashraf, you're here in person. But certainly that invitation extends to you as well, if you'd like.
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for that. That was really. Okay, well, hey, 14 minutes early, so we'll take it, right? So on behalf of my co-chair here, Commissioner Sarli, thanks to our wonderful staff, looking forward to seeing this teed up for Planning Commission and certainly other advisory groups. And this concludes our joint LRTC ZOCO meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.